Hi, my name is Mike Wilch and I'm with Plumline Solutions. Today we are going to be looking at one of the new features that are available in Microsoft Dynamics SL 2015. In the Deduction Maintenance screen, under the Deduction tab, there is a new checkbox called Selecting Calculate Fixed Percent Deduction based on Earning Subject Year-to-Date. This feature is new in Microsoft Dynamics SL 2015. In this video, you will walk through what this feature does and how to use this feature. If you open up the deduction screen in the payroll module, you'll see this new Calculate Fixed Percent Deduction based on Earning Subject Year-to-Date checkbox. Let's first talk about what this feature does. When you have this feature enabled, it lets the deduction be calculated on the remaining max year-to-date subject base, instead of being limited by the current rate multiplied by the fixed percent rate. Selecting this checkbox is useful if the rate decreases during the year and the employee had not reached their max year-to-date subject base limit. With the checkbox cleared, the deduction calculates to a maximum deduction amount of the current rate times the max year-to-date subject base. This might be lower than the rate times whatever part of the maximum subject base has not been used yet. This checkbox is active when the calculation method is fixed percent. You must update your fixed percent deductions if you want to take advantage of this new feature. Now let's take a look at a few examples. In our first example, we will use employee subject earnings year to date. This employee's monthly salary is $8,333.33. This employee only has one deduction, and that deduction is set up as a fixed percent at 10%, and it has a max year-to-date subject base of $7,000. A check has already been cut for this employee, so this deduction has been maxed out. As you can see, the year-to-date subject earnings for this deduction are $7,000, and the year-to-date deductions are $700. If we take a look at this employee in the system, you can see my deduction is test, and you can see the year-to-date deductions are $700 and the year-to-date earning subject deductions are $7,000. Now let's say that deduction rate changes to 15%. If you do not have this new checkbox enabled, you'll see that the deduction is calculated to deduct $350 for this paycheck. This is calculated because at a rate of 15% and a max subject base of $7,000, the max year-to-date deduction is $1,050, and $700 already has been calculated on a previous payroll. So $350 is the difference between the max year-to-date deduction of $1,050 and the amount from a previous payroll of $700. Now let's take a look at how that looks in the system. You can see here for my test deduction, I have changed the fixed rate percent to 15%, and the new Calculate Fixed Percent Deduction based on Earning Subject Year-to-Date checkbox is unchecked. Now that I changed the fixed percentage to 15%, I have ran a recalculation, and now looking at that in the Review Edit check screen for this employee, you can see that the calculated deduction amount for the test deduction is $350, and the year-to-date amount is $1,050. Now let's say that you do have that checkbox enabled after you have changed the percentage rate to 15%. When you do the recalculation, you will see that deduction amount is $0 for this paycheck. This is calculated as $0 because the max year-to-date subject base of $7,000 has already been reached in a previous payroll, so no more deduction amounts will be made for this deduction. Now let's take a look at how that looks within the system. You can see in this scenario, the deduction is still at 15%, and now I do have the Calculate Fixed Percent Deduction based on Earning Subject Year-to-Date checked. I did a recalculation on this employee, and now you can see that the current amount for this deduction is now 0, and the year-to-date amount is $700. So this was an example of an employee that had reached their max year-to-date subject earnings, and then the deduction amount had increased. Now let's take a look at an example of an employee that has not reached the max subject year-to-date earnings for the deduction, and the deduction percentage rate decreases. So in example 2, we are going to look at employee subject earnings year-to-date 2. This employee's monthly salary is $2,000. This employee also only has one deduction, and that deduction is set up as a fixed percent at 10% and has max year-to-date subject base of $7,000. A check has already been cut for this employee, so this deduction has a year-to-date subject earnings of $2,000 and the year-to-date deductions are $200. So this employee has not reached the max year-to-date subject base amount yet. So if we look at this employee in the system, you can see my deduction ID for this employee is test 2, and the year-to-date deductions are $200 with the year-to-date subject earnings of $2,000. Now let's say that the deduction rate changes to 2%. If you do not have this new checkbox enabled, you'll see that the deduction is calculated to deduct $0 for this check. This is calculated because at a rate of 2% and a max subject base of $7,000, the max year-to-date deduction for this new rate is $140, and $200 has already been calculated on a previous payroll, so no more deduction amounts will be calculated for this deduction. Let's take a look at how that looks in the system. So for deduction test 2, I've changed the fixed rate percent to 2%, and I do not have the calculate fixed percent deduction based on earnings subject year-to-date checked. I've done a recalculation for this employee after making the changes to 2% and leaving that box unchecked, and you can see that the calculated deduction amount for deduction test 2 is $0. If you do have this new checkbox checked, then you will see that the deduction is calculated to deduct $40 for this paycheck. This is calculated as $40 because the max year-to-date subject base of $7,000 and only $2,000 was calculated on a previous payroll. So this deduction will continue to be calculated up to the year-to-date subject earnings of $7,000 is reached. Now let's take a look at how that looks in the system. You can see for deduction test 2, I have now checked the calculate fixed percent deduction based on earnings subject year-to-date. I went ahead and did a recalculation for this employee after I had made those changes to the test 2 deduction, and you can see now after the recalculation that the test 2 deduction now has a $40 deduction. So this was an example of an employee that had not reached the max year-to-date subject earnings, and the deduction percentage rate decreased in the middle of the year. These were just some examples of how a fixed percent deduction will be calculated differently depending on if you have calculate fixed percent deduction based on earnings subject year-to-date checked or unchecked. This concludes the video on this new checkbox feature. I hope this video was helpful.